Garama!
Most of my time spent playing through Hollow Knight Silksong was spent on a call with a friend who was playing the game at the same time. This was so that we could share our discoveries with one another and explore as many of Farloom's secrets as we could before inevitably looking up the places that we both managed to miss. As we progressed through the game, my friend was able to make one particular discovery that, in contrast to the others that he made up until this point, he strongly discouraged me from exploring myself. This discovery was Biowater, which is now regarded as the most infamous area in the entire game. He described the area as a mix between Blighttown from Dark Souls, for obvious reasons, and Lost Izalith from the same game due to having the most grueling boss run back in the entire game. Unsurprisingly, my friend had an absolutely miserable time exploring Biowater due to the muck maggot mechanic, the challenging boss fight waiting at the end, and the aforementioned run back to that boss fight. While I eventually discovered the area myself, I ultimately decided to procrastinate exploring it as a result of my friend's warnings, and that decision would end up paying off in a major way. As by the time I finally did decide to delve into the depths of Biowater myself, I had two specific tools that were able to give me a completely different experience in the area. The first was the Wreath of Purity, which granted me a temporary immunity to the horrible muck maggots and allowed me to discover a secret bench that made the boss run back significantly shorter. The second was the Volt Vessels, which due to their high damage output and ability to instantly trigger in the water, made the infamous boss of the area, Groll the Great, an absolute breeze. All in all, I enjoyed my time in Biowater. Yes, you heard me right, I thoroughly enjoyed my time in Biowater. As a result of my over-preparation, I was able to progress through the area at a smooth pace while enjoying its atmosphere and haunting music. And I think that the contrast between my friend's miserable experience in Biowater and my pleasant experience in the area perfectly exemplifies a key element of Silksong's design that I have unfortunately seen go unnoticed by many players. Hollow Knight Silksong is a Metroidvania, meaning that it is defined by non-linear exploration and ability-based progression. Metroidvanias are games that are all about slowly mapping out a large world while gradually becoming capable enough to take on its several challenges. And as such, they are often much more complex than games that simply involve going from point A to point B. This is a philosophy that is baked into the game's very design, as when players do attempt to simply progress through a Metroidvania in a linear fashion, they are often met with a roadblock that prevents them from doing so, forcing them to explore their surroundings in order to find the key to overcoming that roadblock. For games that are more centered around platforming, this roadblock often comes in the form of a gap that cannot be crossed or a door that cannot be opened. However, for more combat-oriented games, they can often come in the form of a challenging foe that is meant to be overcome once the player becomes strong enough to competently defeat them. However, this type of roadblock is different from the typical uncrossable gap or locked door because in most cases, they can be overcome at any point, at any time, provided that the player could reach them in the first place. And while I would overall consider this to be a positive alteration to the formula, as it opens up the world a lot more and allows for several different routes for navigating through it, this design choice has unintentionally created an issue that has negatively impacted the reception of games such as Hollow Knight Silksong. Because players know that defeating the towering boss blocking their way is possible as soon as they discover it, they feel naturally inclined to do battle with that boss as many times as it takes so that they can defeat it as soon as possible. This leads to situations where players will throw themselves at a boss that they are underprepared for hours on end as opposed to exploring the world around them to grow strong enough to take that boss down with ease. And while this isn't a very large problem in a vacuum, people can play games however they like after all, it has grown in scale so much in recent years that it's led to many players calling games like Hollow Knight Silksong too challenging. This is something that I have a major issue with for a couple of reasons. But before I delve into those reasons, I think it's important to explore why exactly this phenomena has grown as much as it has. And if you ask me, its origin can be traced back to a little game called Elden Ring. As a relative of the Metroidvania, the Souls-like genre, pioneered by From Software, is quite interesting because while it too focuses on non-linear exploration, its roadblocks preventing the player from progressing almost always come in the form of powerful and challenging bosses. In addition to this, FromSoft's Soulsborne titles quickly became infamous for their brutal difficulty. While I wouldn't call them the most difficult games in the world, I cannot deny that their punishing areas and ruthless bosses certainly make their reputation well earned, and as such, they were not often recommended for the faint of heart. This all changed with the release of Elden Ring, which due to its titanic hype cycle and unreal scale, was quickly able to enter the mainstream and become the best-selling Souls-like game of all time. The Soulsborne series was certainly popular prior to this release, but Elden Ring was able to take this series to new heights and expose it to millions of people who were previously too scared to dare touch a Souls-like. And From Software was well aware of the splash that Elden Ring would make, as they took several steps towards making the game more accessible than any Soulsborne game that had come before it. In addition to making the game open world, which was a huge shakeup that I'll discuss more in a moment, Elden Ring has a nearly unlimited number of weapons, pieces of armor, spells, ashes of war, talismans, spirit ashes, crystal tears, the list goes on. And when properly utilized, these tools can make Elden Ring an infinitely smoother experience than any of the games that came before it, allowing even the most infamous of bosses to fall with relative ease with the right set of tools. This level of customization paired well with the game's open world design, which enabled players to explore the lands between at their own pace as they gather new tools that they can mix and match in any way they choose. This was one of Elden Ring's greatest strengths, player expression. No Elden Ring build looks identical to another, allowing players to truly make the tarnish their own. However, this positive trait would have unforeseen consequences, as some veterans of the Dark Souls trilogy were disappointed at how Elden Ring's vast array of tools took away from the challenge that its predecessors held. And instead of criticizing the game itself for this relatively valid concern, some individuals decided to direct their negativity towards the players themselves. This is how a group of elitists who were dead set on invalidating the victories of other players was formed. And while this is admittedly pretty standard fare for most communities, the influence of these elitists would extend far beyond any that came before them, as this ideology of invalidating others for using the mechanics given to them is something that spread across the greater Elden Ring community as a whole, so much so that it quickly became a core component of its identity. Eventually, players were labeled as cheaters for using certain status effects, spirit ashes, or for simply utilizing multiplayer. And the only victory that was considered valid was one that was won using nothing but the bare essentials. You didn't beat her, you used summons, you used bleed, you spammed ranged attacks, you used Ashes of War, you upgraded your weapon, you leveled up your character, you used a controller, you turned the screen on, you used electricity, you used the concept of time, the nerve. And while this culture is certainly not one that enveloped the entire Elden Ring community, it is one that led to many players playing the game in a way that it wasn't intended to be played, fearful that if they did what From Software intended and explore the lands between for tools that would grant them an advantage, then their victories would not be truly earned. And just like that, one of, if not the single greatest game ever made, had been poisoned by one of the 7 deadly sins, pride. Elden Ring became a game that, to some, was more about upholding pride than it was genuinely enjoying and experiencing the game. This would lead to many players challenging bosses before they were intended to solely for the purpose of showing that they are skilled enough to do so. There are several examples that I can use to demonstrate my point, but no one does that better than the very first tree sentinel at the beginning of the game. The purpose of this boss is simple. It's made to teach the player that they can't run headfirst into every boss they see. It's meant to be a humbling experience, showing players that they will need to come back to some bosses later after properly equipping themselves. This lesson is relatively obvious and easy to understand, but that still didn't stop some players from fighting the tree sentinel for multiple hours at the very beginning of the game just to prove a point. Unfortunately, the presence of Stakes of Marika only made this pursuit of pride more enticing. In previous Soulsborne titles, players were almost always subjected to what is commonly referred to as a boss runback, which simply describes the distance that they need to cover in order to have another attempt at the boss fight. Boss runbacks are often criticized for wasting the player's time and preventing them from attempting a boss as many times as they'd like with no downtime. But they actually served a very important purpose, and that purpose was ironically just mentioned. They prevented players from attempting a boss as many times as they liked with no downtime. This was actually a positive thing in many ways, as running back to a boss fight gave players time to think about what went wrong, what went right, and what they needed to do differently in order to claim victory. And since they're sent back to a safe space, they're granted the ability to make adjustments to their build that can then go on to make the difference needed to succeed. Stakes of Marika, while convenient, remove this downtime, causing players to throw themselves at a boss endlessly without mixing up their strategy in any way, leading to them reasoning that their own execution is the problem rather than their strategy. You won't hear me advocating for the removal of Stakes of Marika in future Soulsborne titles, but I can't deny that they played a part in Elden Ring becoming a game about pride for many. Now, let me be clear. It is more than okay to persist through a difficult boss fight for personal satisfaction. My favorite boss fight in Elden Ring's base game is Mohg, Lord of Blood, and the only reason he is because I fought him semi-early, which forced me to use everything I had to the best of my ability in order to finally come out on top. I don't think there's anything wrong with this. I was fully aware of the fact that I was unnecessarily raising the difficulty for myself, and I actually had a better experience with the boss because I did. My issue, and the reason that this video was being created in the first place, is the people who will unknowingly inflict this challenge upon themselves and then proceed to call the game too difficult as a result. Now, admittedly, these types of players are relatively few and far between when it comes to Elden Ring. More often than not, players are well aware of when they're holding themselves back, and so they don't complain about the game itself because they know that they could be stronger if they tried to be. However, there are a certain set of players who, as a direct result of the pride-fueled culture forged by the Elden Ring community, actually ended up forgetting about the various tools at their disposal because to them, they genuinely aren't even options. This can lead to players having terrible, grueling experiences with the game because they're only using a fraction of what is available to them, ultimately leaving a sour taste in their mouths. This brings me to a figure who is debatably even more infamous than Silksong's Bile Water, Promised Consort Radahn. A boss so brutal, so ludicrously difficult, that he significantly altered the discussion of Elden Ring's incredible DLC expansion from one of pure positivity into a debate over whether or not From Software had taken things too far with their difficulty. And this controversial, polarizing boss fight is my favorite Souls-like boss fight of all time. As the final boss of a DLC expansion that's meant to be played near the tail end of the base game, Promised Consort Radahn is a boss that demanded that all of the game's mechanics be used to their absolute fullest. Tools that were previously used to trivialize bosses were now simply used to level the playing field, and I had to use everything I could to take down this titanic threat. Bleed, Scarlet Rot, Destined Death, the whole 9 yards. Everything was needed to defeat the Promised Consort, making me truly feel like I had earned the message, God slain. So why do I feel like I'm in the minority when I say that I love this battle? Well, when you consider everything that I've been discussing, it should be rather simple to understand. As I stated, Promised Consort Radahn is a boss that demanded that every advantage that could be taken should be taken. So what happens when an army of players who have never used over half of Elden Ring's mechanics challenge him? Well, they get obliterated. And unfortunately, the typical method of stubbornly pressing on is at its worst in this battle in particular. And so, not knowing what to do, many fans claim that Promised Consort Radahn was the most unbalanced, least fair boss fight in the entire series, unaware of the fact that the answers are readily available to them. Now let me be clear. Even with every tool being used to the best of its ability, Promised Consort Radahn is still probably the single most challenging boss fight in all of Soulsborne history. I don't blame players of any kind for struggling to defeat him, but I do believe that he perfectly showcased the type of player base that Elden Ring had fostered and exposed many of its flaws that were spawned by some key design choices, an elitist culture, and the meaningless pursuit of pride. And unfortunately, this is a mindset that would go on to affect Hollow Knight's Silksong as well, as the game shares a large majority of its fans with Elden Ring and the Soulsborne series as a whole, due to having a similar structure and similar theming. Silksong is also similar to Elden Ring due to its overwhelming hype cycle and gargantuan scale, so it's really no wonder that the fan bases of both games would overlap. And so, the problems with the Elden Ring community that I discussed would persist with the release of Hollow Knight's Silksong, only this time, it would debatably be even worse. The original Hollow Knight is a game that thrived on its simplistic gameplay. The charm system allowed for a good deal of player expression, but the core gameplay was incredibly easy to understand, which was part of what made the game great, because mastering that gameplay was incredibly satisfying. Conversely, Hollow Knight's Silksong focuses much more on player expression like Elden Ring does, with a vast array of crests and tools that dramatically alter the gameplay. And like with Elden Ring, this is one of my favorite parts about the game, as it allowed me to create a build that truly felt like it was my own, while the friend that I mentioned was experimenting with completely different builds that were incredibly potent. This is exactly why I was quite disappointed to see that many players were making the exact same mistake that they made in Elden Ring. These players often stick only to using their standard weapon and refuse to use any of their tools, despite the fact that those tools can grant a major advantage. Now, unlike in Elden Ring, there may be a handful of reasons for why this is. I'd be willing to bet that there are plenty of players who aren't as fond of the amount of player expression that the game provides, and would rather keep things simple like they were in the original Hollow Knight. So they grabbed the Wanderer's Crest to imitate that playstyle and kept to good old-fashioned jumping and slashing. There are also people who are likely nervous about losing bone shards used to craft their tools, which is not so different from saving all of your potions in a JRPG until the final boss, because you might need them later. While I have certainly been in this place myself before, I think that there comes a time when one needs to realize these resources exist to be used. And the developers designed the game in such a way so that it's hard to fully run out of them. Speaking of which, I've also seen players who have complained about attempting a boss so many times that they actually did run out of bone shards, and so now they need to grind to get more. In my opinion, this is the horrible misunderstanding of how Hollow Knight Silksong is designed to be played. If one reaches a point where they have fully run out of bone shards, then that is a clear, undeniable message to the player telling them to take a break from the boss that they're fighting and to explore the world in order to get stronger before trying again. But due to this prideful culture fostered by Elden Ring, this is a message that flies over some players' heads. And that's the main reason why I felt the need to make this video. Over the past few years, the community that plays games such as Elden Ring and Hollow Knight Silksong has encouraged a playstyle that goes against the very design of the games themselves. The bosses of the lands between and Farloom were never meant to be battled for hours on end until the player has perfected their moveset. They were meant to be roadblocks telling the player to go out and experience as many aspects of the game as possible before coming back stronger and more prepared to take them on. It's one of the elements that makes these games what they are, and unfortunately, it's one that has been lost to many. I'll end this video by saying that I am not above any of this. While I was lucky enough to over-prepare for Biowater, I was not so lucky when it came to Silksong's other most infamous threat, the Savage Beastfly. Like many, I challenged this boss far too early, and instead of turning back and returning later, I fought him for longer than I'm willing to confess. And while I eventually came out on top, I was seriously beginning to wonder if Hollow Knight Silksong was taking things a little too far with its difficulty. However, as I pressed on, became stronger, and honed my skills as a player, what I found waiting for me was one of the most refined, customizable, and gratifying games that I have ever experienced. So if you're someone who has ever quit Hollow Knight Silksong, Elden Ring, or any similar game because it was simply too difficult, then I urge you to pick it up again, and rather than fight the boss that made you quit in the first place, try exploring the world around you and seeing what you can find. I can't make any promises, but you might just find exactly what you need.